During her late-night shift at the hospital, Barbara was interrupted by a 6 a.m. text from her husband. The message carried a disturbing tone. Becky's boss called the house. She didn't show up for work. I'm running late and racing out the door. Will you call her? Concerned, Barbara immediately dialed her daughter Becky's cell phone, only to be met with 6 unanswered rings before the call was inevitably sent to voicemail. Barbara was annoyed by the news, so she left an angry message assuming Becky had overslept after a night of drinking with friends. Wake up. Get to work. Be responsible, she shouted in her messages. Barbara repeatedly called Becky, but each attempt to reach her went directly to voicemail. A deep sense of unease settled in Barbara's soul, as Becky's unresponsiveness is completely out of character. As 8:15 a.m. approached, 2 long hours had passed with no word from Becky. Barbara's initial anger was now giving way to growing worry. As she headed home from work, Barbara continued her attempts to reach Becky. Retracing the events from the night before, Barbara checked her text messages. She knew Becky made it home because Becky texted her around 3 a.m. when she got there, saying, "I'm going to bed. I love you." As Barbara rounded the corner to her house, a sense of relief washed over her at the sight of Becky's car in the yard. But that relief swiftly transformed back into anger. Barbara was now convinced that Becky was being irresponsible by oversleeping. But as she opened the door and stepped into Becky's room, finding no sign of her daughter, Barbara's worry set in again. Her heart raced uncontrollably the moment she realized that Becky's purse and ID were there in the room, but her phone wasn't. It was noticeably missing. Becky never leaves without her phone. But if she had her phone with her, why wasn't she answering her mother's calls? Could she be hungover and crashing at a friend's house? Or was there a more ominous explanation for her sudden disappearance? The torment consumed Barbara, but no one could have been prepared for the horrific discoveries the search for Becky would reveal. This is the story of Rebecca Koster. We're going to get into it, but first be sure to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on updates to this story, trending true crime topics, and so much more. Now let's get into it. 24-year-old Rebecca Koster, or Becky as she was known to friends and family, was a beautiful and bubbly young woman who possessed a natural talent for spreading happiness. She was gorgeous and had a big, bright, beautiful smile. Becky's presence guaranteed a good day for everyone around her. She was always cheerful. To her friends and family, she was a ray of sunshine, kind, and it was her infectious positivity that led to her role as a caregiver. Working as a home health care aide, Becky spent her days looking after the elderly and people with autism. She found fulfillment in her work, and one patient stood out particularly. He was a developmentally disabled young man who she came to adore. Helping others was a value instilled in Becky by her family, especially her mother Barbara, who is a nurse. In the early stages of her career, Becky worked at the hospital alongside Barbara. Her coworkers regarded her as a compassionate and warm individual, someone who approached each patient with the same care she would provide her own grandparents. Becky's infectious personality and kindness extended beyond her professional life. Barbara describes her as sweet and so sensitive that she wouldn't harm a fly. Beyond their mother-daughter bond, Becky and Barbara were friends. Many would say they were like sisters, confiding in each other every day. Becky still lived at home with her mother, her brother Damien, and her stepfather Larry, who absolutely adored her. Becky was also known to lift the spirits of her friends with quirky gestures. According to her mother, Becky had a habit of taking bologna from her and sneaking it into her purse. Then when she would go out with the girls, she'd take out a piece from her secret stash, eat it, and then offer them some when they would ask, "What is that?" Surrounded by her loving family and a tight circle of friends, Becky maintained a healthy social life. She especially enjoyed the moments spent with her best friend, Nicole. Together they would explore the local bars and dance the night away. Becky naturally drew attention whenever she entered the room, and admirers vied for her interest. Her slender 5'5", 112-pound stature turned heads, but it was her vibrant personality that captivated those around her. Unfortunately, these very qualities sometimes drew the wrong kind of attention into her life. Despite the many suitors captivated by her stunning beauty, Becky maintained humility, and her love life was full too. She had a boyfriend at the time. His name was Dan Mayer. They met through their mutual friend Jason at a party. According to Barbara, Dan appeared to be a nice guy. He seemed to be very infatuated with Becky, and Becky enjoyed his company too. Dan was very attentive to Becky and would often pick her up from work. They had only been dating about 2 months, but according to Becky's friends, Dan really loved her. It was evident in the way Dan looked at her. But given the newness of the relationship, commitment wasn't on the immediate horizon for the couple. Becky had just gotten out of a relationship and wanted to take things slow. She was a free spirit and wasn't in a rush to tie the knot. She was passionate about enjoying life, having fun, and she cherished her work, her supportive family, and close-knit group of friends. Everything seemed perfect until the morning of December 4th. Thursday, December 3rd, 3 p.m. In the clear, crisp winter afternoon of December 3rd, as residents in the Long Island suburb of Medford concluded their workday and busied themselves with Christmas preparations, Barbara emerged for her daily routine. Having wrapped up her usual overnight shift around 8 this morning, she got out of bed around 3 p.m., prepared dinner, and geared up for her next shift at the hospital, starting at 7:45 p.m. Earlier this evening, Becky informed Barbara of her plans to go out to a bar with her best friend, Nicole. She said that Dan might join them later. Becky was consistently thoughtful about checking in with Barbara. She knew how much Barbara worried, so she made it a habit to inform her mother when she arrived home or send a text upon reaching her destination. Despite their shared understanding, Barbara felt compelled to regularly reiterate the request. Make sure you text me when you get home. And on this day, like any other day, Becky assured her that she would. In the early evening hours, Becky's workday eventually came to an end, and true to her plan, she rendezvoused with Nicole at Butcher Boy's Bar and Grill in Holbrook. And as promised, Dan joined them later that evening. After an enjoyable time filled with laughter and drinks, Nicole decided to call it a night. She had an early shift at work the next morning. But before departing, she made sure Becky had a ride home. Dan assured Nicole that he would take Becky home, and with that assurance, Nicole left. Friday, December 4th, 3 a.m. Around 3 in the morning during her break at work, Barbara received a text from Becky confirming she was home, saying, "I'm going to bed. I love you." Barbara replied, "Okay, sleep well. You have to be at work in a couple of hours. Good night. I love you." 3 hours later, Larry was rushing out of the door for work when he received an unusual call from Becky's boss saying Becky hadn't shown for her 6 a.m. shift. In a hurry, Larry texted Barbara, who was still at work. He wrote, "Becky's boss called the house. She didn't show up for work. I'm late for work and racing out of the door. Will you call her?" A bit concerned, Barbara promptly dialed Becky's number. The phone rang 6 times before diverting to voicemail. Frustrated by the news, Barbara left an angry message urging Becky to take responsibility and get to work. After 15 minutes with no response, Barbara attempted to call again, only to be met with voicemail once more. 8:15 a.m., 5 hours, no response from Becky. A growing sense that something wasn't right unsettled Barbara. On her anxious ride home from work, and then seeing Becky's parked car in the yard, Barbara grew angry again because she was convinced that Becky was being irresponsible, sleeping in after a night out drinking. Entering the house, she went straight to Becky's room to discover Becky's purse and ID in her room, but Becky and her phone were nowhere to be found. Barbara panicked and immediately called Nicole, who had no information on Becky's whereabouts. But Nicole did mention that Becky planned to get a ride home from Dan. So Barbara called Dan, and Dan insisted he had dropped Becky off around 3:30 a.m. and ensured she entered the house. But Barbara was suspicious, so she pressed, "Dan, please don't lie to me. I just want to know she's okay." Dan maintained that Becky was not with him. "I swear to you, she's not here," he said. Barbara thought, maybe her phone died and she has no way to call. Recalling the events from the previous night, she knew Becky had been out with Nicole and Dan. Nicole departed around midnight, leaving Becky and Dan at the bar for a bit longer. Dan claimed he walked Becky to the door of her home, ensuring she entered before leaving. However, doubt crept in. Where could she have gone without her ID? Was Dan telling the truth, or was there something he was hiding? 7:30 p.m., 16 hours, and no sign of Becky. 16 hours had elapsed since Becky went missing. Neither Dan nor any of Becky's family had received any word from her. Growing increasingly concerned, Barbara was now convinced that something was terribly wrong. When Larry returned home, together they made the difficult decision to involve the police and file a missing persons report. It was highly unusual for Becky not to call or inform her mother of her whereabouts. By that time of day, Becky would typically have been up and about and active on her phone, yet there was complete silence. This was out of character for her, and Barbara's anxiety had escalated to a point of absolute fear. In her distressed state, Barbara couldn't help but entertain the worst-case scenario. Perhaps someone had harmed Becky, but she had no clue who could have wanted to hurt her daughter. Everyone loved her, and as far as Barbara knew, Becky had no enemies. Barbara wondered who could have done something to Becky. Why hadn't she made contact? The unknowns intensified the family's worry. Larry urgently placed the call to the police stating, "We need an officer at the house. Please, our daughter is missing." Responding promptly, the police sent an officer over to take a report. When the officer arrived, he asked the usual questions to gather pertinent information for the search. But then the interview was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Dan, and he had one burning question on his mind. Shortly after arriving, he asked Barbara, "Is Becky seeing anyone else?" Visibly annoyed by Dan's question, Barbara responded firmly, "No." Unfazed by Barbara's response, Dan pressed further, "Are you sure?" Barbara insisted, "Yes, I'm sure, and this is really not the time for this." Barbara found it odd that amid the urgency of their daughter's disappearance, Dan seemed more concerned about Becky potentially seeing someone else. Barbara thought, how dare he? Did he fail to understand that Becky was missing? Or could this behavior indicate something else altogether? Dan's question raised eyebrows for everyone in Becky's family. 9 p.m., 17 and a half hours, and still no sign of Becky. As temperatures in Medford plummeted overnight, so did Barbara's heavy heart. Growing increasingly distressed, she couldn't help but worry, hoping Becky was somewhere warm. Desperate to know her daughter's whereabouts, Barbara fired off a series of voicemails and text messages pleading with Becky. She wrote, "Becky, please call home. We are so worried. I love you so much. Please call. Call me immediately, please. I have to hear your voice. Are you okay? Please let us know you're okay. Where are you? Do you need us to come get you?" Despite Barbara's heartfelt messages, there was still no answer from Becky. Barbara was exhausted, but unable to sleep, so she and the family decided to take matters into their own hands to find Becky. She took time off from work to focus on the search effort and made their living room a makeshift headquarters, with Becky's friends camping out there. Larry came up with the idea to look into Becky's call history and use GPS to track her phone, since her phone was on the family plan. Knowing that Becky's phone wasn't at the house, they concluded she likely had it with her. Lo and behold, a ping from Becky's cell phone revealed its location just 12 miles west of their home. The family hastily made their way to the neighborhood, understanding that finding Becky's phone could lead them to her. But they had no luck finding her there. 19 hours had elapsed since Becky was last seen. Around 10 p.m., the family devised a plan to coordinate efforts with the police. Larry gave law enforcement access to Becky's call logs, while friends and family diligently monitored her social media and the cell phone location tracking. It was moving. Becky's phone was moving from place to place, toggling on and off, pinging across various locations, and at the moment, it was signaling in Port Jefferson. Each time they got a ping, the family promptly alerted the police, initiating a search in the corresponding areas. If the ping was close by, the family would go out, calling and shouting Becky's name. Despite their tireless efforts, Becky's whereabouts remained elusive. December 5th, 8 a.m., 28 hours, and no sign of Becky. No one had heard from Becky for about 28 hours, so everyone agreed it was time to expand the search. Barbara and Larry had flyers printed with Becky's physical description and image and started canvassing the tight-knit neighborhood where Becky grew up, asking if anyone had seen her. Dan also joined in as they placed flyers everywhere they could think of putting them. The family returned to the bar where Becky was last seen, but no one there recognized her. They reached out to every contact imaginable. Despite their efforts, their hopes began to wane as there was no sign of Becky in the neighborhood. At this juncture, Barbara couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that Dan might be keeping Becky in some undisclosed location. To her, he was the one and only person of interest. But widespread speculation about whether he was holding Becky hostage somewhere began to grow in the community as well. Amidst the suspicions, Becky's friends also observed Dan's rapidly escalating anxiety. The mounting pressure was causing him to spiral out of control, as not only Becky's friends and family became suspicious, but the community itself was turning against him, leveling accusations. In this tight-knit community where everyone was intensely invested in finding Becky, collective scrutiny was growing, and Dan found himself at the center of it all. Even people unfamiliar with Becky or her family had taken to staking out Dan's residence, eager to catch any potential slip-ups. As the last person known to have seen her, Dan had become the prime suspect. Growing increasingly desperate, the family carefully combed through Becky's call logs for any potential leads. The last incoming and outgoing number was an out-of-state number with a 617 area code. Barbara found herself puzzled as she didn't recognize it. Asking Becky's friends if they knew the number yielded no answers. No one knew the owner of that number. They tried calling it to no avail. Seeking answers, the family turned to Dan, hoping he might have some insight. But he said he didn't know either. Barbara then turned her attention to Becky's social media accounts, only to be confronted with a shocking discovery. The family was left stunned to see that Dan had changed his Facebook profile. Dan had changed his name to Dan the Killer. This change, occurring just 24 hours after Becky's disappearance, increased the family's suspicion about him. Dan's actions began to raise eyebrows for everyone involved, and the name change was particularly startling. As the last person known to have seen Becky alive, the sudden alteration of his Facebook account to Dan the Killer raised disturbing questions, leading the family to believe that Dan may be concealing more than he was letting on. Had he become jealous and snapped? Was this a confession? Dan's peculiar actions only served to heighten suspicion rather than alleviate it. So Barbara took her concerns straight to the police. She was convinced now that Dan might be involved. Upon hearing what Becky's family had uncovered, detectives found themselves sharing the same suspicions about Dan. In pursuit of answers, detectives diligently worked on constructing a timeline, recognizing that in many cases, the last person in contact with the missing person often holds critical information about where they are. So detectives immediately made Dan the focus of their investigation. And for detectives, Dan was the only person of interest. Becky's failure to return home or contact her family led them to suspect foul play. So the detectives decided to search Becky's room for potential clues. As the family realized that their home might be a potential crime scene, a sense of dread overcame them. As they watched the investigators collect samples from Becky's hairbrush, her toothbrush, and anything she had touched, It was the first time they contemplated the worst. During the search, they thoroughly examined the room for any signs of struggle, but their efforts yielded nothing to suggest a possible crime scene. So the detectives proceeded to bring Dan in for questioning. When questioned about the events of December 3rd, Dan stuck to the same narrative he told Barbara. He recounted, "We were hanging out at Butcher Boy's bar, had a few drinks, and at the end of the evening, I brought Becky home." According to Dan, he walked her to the door, bid her good night, and then went home. Then detectives asked if that was the last time he had seen or spoken to her, to which Dan said yes. Detectives then posed the question, "Did you two have a fight?" Dan firmly replied, "No, we didn't have any problems." Dan vehemently denied any involvement in Becky's disappearance. He said, "I didn't hurt her, I swear." Then what Dan would say next left detectives questioning his honesty. After a brief pause in the interrogation, Dan confessed, I was starting to think that Becky was becoming distant." According to Dan, he sensed a growing distance between them and admitted to feeling more invested in the relationship than Becky. He conveyed that their relationship had shifted to a casual status. He was uncertain about their future. Dan suggested that Becky might have been seeing someone else and even hinted at the possibility of her connecting with someone she met that night at the bar. He said she talked with other people. She often did. Dan continued that on that particular night, Becky had spent a significant amount of time talking to one man in particular. He recalled noticing this interaction when he went to the restroom and observed the man sitting there near Becky. Interestingly, Dan claimed he didn't know the mystery man, emphasizing that the man had discreetly slipped away as he returned from the restroom. These details left the detectives with a myriad of questions surrounding the night's events. Detectives wrestled with the possibility that the incident with the other man might be linked to Becky's mysterious disappearance. The idea that Becky could have been engaging with another man at the bar raised questions of possible infidelity and of a plausible motive for Dan to harm Becky. And Dan's questions about Becky possibly cheating didn't help his plight. Detectives were fully aware of Dan's jealous nature. "Dan the killer," detectives pressed. "Why would you change to that on your profile?" Clearly agitated, Dan shouted, "It doesn't mean anything, all right? I did not hurt Becky." Lacking a solid reason to hold Dan, detectives told him he was free to leave. However, Dan remained their prime suspect. The detectives proceeded to Butcher Boy's bar, one of Becky's last known locations. When they questioned the staff, no one recognized Becky. Detectives then asked about their surveillance cameras, and the bar provided the footage revealing Becky with her friends. As the detectives examined the footage, they identified a man resembling the mystery man described by Dan. When Dan excused himself to go to the restroom, the police observed another man approaching Becky. The surveillance video showed him taking Becky's phone and them exchanging numbers, and as Dan returned, the mystery man hastily departed. Detectives were left wondering about the identity and significance of this mystery man captured on the bar's surveillance footage. They wondered, did Dan witness this mystery man exchanging phone numbers with Becky? And could this have fueled jealousy or other motives leading him to harm her? Detectives are aware that with each passing hour, the chances of finding Becky alive are diminishing. While attempting to maintain a hopeful demeanor, Barbara was slowly realizing the possibility that her daughter may never return home. December 6th, 2 days since Becky's disappearance. 2 days have passed since Becky's disappearance, and her family finds themselves struggling with diminishing hope. In their collective distress, all they could do was support one another and pray for the best. However, on that Sunday, December 6th, a mere 2 days after Becky's disappearance, a remarkable thing happened. While at her sister Elaine's house delivering a Christmas gift, Barbara glanced at her phone and discovered a text from Becky. "Mom, Dan has me tied up in a basement. I need your help." The message instigated a heightened sense of panic and a renewed sense of hope at the same time. Nervous, Barbara attempted to call the phone, but there was no answer. She questioned why would Becky text her instead of contacting the police directly. It didn't make sense. But after some thought, she concluded that most children would instinctively call their mothers first. Hands shaking with tears in her eyes, she texted, "Call 911, they will find you." Then Barbara promptly contacted the detectives and returned home so they could trace the phone's location through the family locator app. Dan, who previously claimed he dropped Becky off at home the night she disappeared, is now suspect number 1. Despite the panic the text brought, Barbara now had a glimmer of hope that Becky was still alive and all they had to do was find her. And according to that text message, Dan's was where she was to be found. Law enforcement and the family bolted to Dan's house. When police arrived, they approached with full force. Dan met the detectives at his front door, insisting he didn't know Becky's whereabouts and wasn't hiding her. Ultimately, Dan was cooperative, allowing the officers to enter without issue. The thorough search extended throughout the entire house, including the basement, as well as neighboring houses, sheds, and garages. Despite the exhaustive efforts, there was no trace of Becky. Detectives maintained their suspicion of Dan. They were reluctant to dismiss his involvement. And Becky's family persisted in their search around Dan's house, mobilizing numerous individuals to comb through the wooded areas, repeatedly calling out Becky's name. But Becky was not there. She was not in his basement. She was not in his backyard. And she was not hidden in a shed around Dan's home. December 7th, 2 a.m., 3 days, and no sign of Becky. Barbara's phone served as her sole connection to Becky, and every beep and ding sent her heart racing. Following the fruitless search at Dan's, the family returned home, attempting to track the phone once more. The location shifted, and along with it, Barbara received a chilling second text. "Dan has me tied up in a basement somewhere in Comac. Don't tell Dan, or he'll kill me." The family successfully traced the location to a heavily wooded commercial area, roughly 20 minutes from their home. Despite the late hour, they urgently piled into their vehicles and raced to the spot. Even though it was 2 a.m. and everything was closed, they persisted in knocking on doors, shouting Becky's name. Regrettably, Comac yielded no sign of Becky. Defeated and fatigued, they returned home. Barbara was shattered. With unanswered text messages and phone calls, they found themselves back at square one. Dan insisted that he and his sister brought Becky home from the bar that night, but the family had serious doubts about that. While the family pursued Becky's cell phone locations, the detectives took the surveillance footage obtained from the bar and showed it to Becky's friends who were there with her that night. The friends confirmed, "Yeah, that's the guy from the bar." Detectives then revisited Becky's phone records, focusing on the last activity before her disappearance. Most calls were to family or friends, but one number stood out. Just before she went missing, right after returning home from the bar, they identified the 617 phone number that had communicated with Becky. It was an unknown number both to police and her family. It was the only peculiar entry in Becky's phone contacts. The name of the contact was J. Brown. So investigators concentrated their efforts on tracing this mysterious number to uncover more information. It was revealed to be a prepaid phone. And although the contact said it was J. Brown, when investigators traced the number, it led back to a man named Evans Ganthier. Now investigators have both a name and a face. And when detectives asked Becky's friends about the mystery man, her friend Jennifer would drop a bombshell. She didn't just recognize Evans from that night. Jennifer remembered Evans because he did the same thing to her. He introduced himself to her using the same tactics, taking her phone, and putting his number into it under the name J. Brown. And lo and behold, when they checked Jennifer's contacts for the comparison, the phone numbers were identical. Upon detectives identifying him as a person of interest, they promptly brought him in for questioning. During the interview, Evans disclosed details about his whereabouts that night. He confirmed it was him on the surveillance video and clarified his interaction with Becky. According to Evans, their conversation at the bar was friendly, and when her boyfriend returned, that was the end of it. Detectives delved further. Did you get her phone number? Evans confirmed, yeah. He explained that he expressed interest in meeting and talking with Becky, to which Becky responded, I've got a boyfriend. I'm in a relationship. I really shouldn't be giving you my phone number. Despite Becky's reservations, Evans acknowledged making a phone call to her later that same morning, as confirmed by the phone records. However, he says Becky declined his invitation to meet. Did that set you off? Detectives asked. Evans insisted, no, there's plenty of fish in the sea. According to Evans, after exchanging numbers, Becky said she had a boyfriend and they left it at that. Following his statement, detectives collected Evans's fingerprints and a DNA sample before letting him go. December 8th, 4 days, and still no sign of Becky. At this juncture, investigators found themselves uncertain about the situation. They remained unsure whether Evans was being truthful or if Dan was aware of Evans, possibly leading to a confrontation. The mystery surrounding Becky's disappearance persisted, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. So, the investigators decided to expand their search, putting out a nationwide notification with descriptive information about Becky to other law enforcement agencies. News networks camped outside of Barbara's house every day since Becky went missing. The notification listed her last known location, Butcher Boys in Holbrook. Shortly after, investigators would receive a critical tip that would alter the course of their investigation. Early in the evening of December 4th, the same day Becky disappeared, about 85 miles away from Medford, a motorist noticed something unusual outside the small rural town of North Stonington, Connecticut. Law enforcement in Connecticut received a report of what initially seemed like a brush fire. However, upon arrival, police made a grim discovery. The flames were consuming human remains. The victim was identified as a young woman. The motorist, who coincidentally was an assistant fire chief, was driving along the narrow road when he stumbled upon the body just seconds after it had been set ablaze. Reacting swiftly, he extinguished the flames. Timing was critical. Had he not arrived when he did, the fire would have consumed everything, leaving no evidence. The victim had been saturated in gasoline. Her body was positioned face up, causing extensive charring to her face and torso. While Suffolk County Police were diligently searching for Becky, Stonington, Connecticut Police issued their own missing persons alert for their Jane Doe, specifying her characteristics. However, during the autopsy conducted by the Connecticut Medical Examiner's Office, it became evident to the attending police officers that the killer had taken deliberate steps to eliminate any identifying features, making it challenging to establish the victim's identity. She had been mutilated. Her fingertips and toes were missing. Her hair, nose, and ears had been cut off. Not all of her body parts were present. The body parts that were not recovered were presumed to have been dumped somewhere. She had a tattoo that was missing from her ankle and one missing from her lower back. They had been carved out of her skin. While examining the remains, the medical examiner made a significant discovery: a piercing and stud in the victim's tongue. It appeared that the killer had either forgotten to remove it or was unaware of its presence. The autopsy conclusively determined that Jane Doe's death was a homicide, attributing the cause to a fatal stab wound inflicted on her liver. Connecticut detectives searched through their missing persons database and stumbled upon a match. The missing persons report was filed quite a distance away, but it seemed to match the Jane Doe they discovered. The likely match was identified to be Becky Koster. Upon learning about the missing persons report from Suffolk County, Connecticut state troopers promptly reached out, confirming the match by noting the distinctive tongue stud that both individuals shared. At this stage, their sole basis for identification rested on the presence of the piercing. Although this detail was an important clue that it might be Becky, it was far from sufficient for confirmation in a homicide investigation. To secure official confirmation, Connecticut investigators sought access to Becky's dental records. After obtaining and examining Becky's dental records, the investigators verified the woman's identity, establishing a conclusive match. It was Becky Koster. With this confirmation, Long Island detectives conveyed the heartbreaking news to her family that Becky was dead. Barbara and Larry were devastated by the news. Then detectives informed them that the case was now being treated as a homicide. Overcome with grief, Barbara abruptly stood up, rushed out of the house, crying and screaming, "Someone murdered my baby." Her worst nightmare had been confirmed. Her daughter would never come home. As they gathered their composure and began discussing the situation, Becky's family recognized that they had come across the news reports about the burning body on the side of the road, which had dominated the headlines around the time Becky went missing, but they didn't initially connect the two cases. They started piecing together that the news about the burning body broke around 7:30 p.m. on December 4th, which was about the same time they were giving their missing persons report to the officer. When this devastating revelation struck them, they also arrived at the eerie conclusion that the messages Barbara received days after Becky disappeared were not from Becky at all. They were from Becky's killer, who was taunting them, pretending to be her, playing with their emotions, and manipulating their hopes that Becky would come back home alive. Knowing this incensed and disgusted the family to the point they addressed Becky's killer directly in the media. Now the pressing question loomed: who could commit such a cruel act? At this point, no suspects are in custody. Detectives began honing in on Becky's cell phone, recognizing that the key to solving her murder lies with it. The individual responsible for Becky's demise was still wielding her cell phone. It was a cold, calculated act, almost appearing to be done with a sinister sense of enjoyment. Analyzing the timing and content of the texts, detectives would come to eliminate Becky's boyfriend as a suspect. It didn't make sense for Dan to incriminate himself in the messages. The text appeared to be a deliberate setup, clearing Dan of suspicion. This turn in the investigation left Barbara with a profound sense of regret, as she and the family had castigated Dan earlier. They came down on him hard. Now, with Dan no longer a suspect, detectives directed their attention toward the remaining person of interest, the man who approached Becky at the bar on the night she vanished, Evans Ganthier. The crime lab made a critical breakthrough in the case when they uncovered a big mistake made by the killer. Initially, expectations for obtaining usable evidence were low due to the inherent destructive nature of fire. But the state crime lab defied the odds. Becky's body was wrapped in plastic, in sheets and a blanket, then sealed with duct tape before it was set on fire. Remarkably, after they very meticulously pulled the duct tape from the sheets, the crime lab managed to extract 2 latent fingerprints from the burned duct tape, a left thumbprint and a right thumbprint. The Connecticut State Police conducted database searches with the prints, but found no matches. So they transported the prints to Suffolk County, where, to their astonishment, they obtained a match to none other than Evans Ganthier. Within hours of finding the match, detectives swiftly took Evans into custody. Following his arrest, investigators conducted a thorough search of Evans's residence and vehicle. Although no blood or evidence of violence was discovered in his home, Signs of thorough cleaning were evident in the garage, where a sizable square-shaped area of the floor had been freshly painted. However, Evans's car told a different story. Upon searching the vehicle, investigators uncovered a pool of blood beneath the passenger seat and identified bloodstains in the luggage compartment in the rear. Armed with cell site records, detectives traced the movement of Evans's phone toward Becky's residence in Medford around 4 a.m. on that fateful morning. A detailed analysis revealed a series of communications between their phones. It was evident that both Becky's and Evans's phones were serviced by the same towers and subsequently moved in the direction of Port Jefferson. Convinced they had their killer, detectives confronted Evans with the incriminating evidence, stating, "We have your prints on the tape you used to wrap her up. You need to tell us what happened." Evans, under pressure, insisted it's not how it looks. He stuck to the narrative of meeting at the bar and exchanging phone numbers. However, facing the mounting evidence, Evans' story began to unravel. "Yes, we did hang out that night," Evans admitted. He recounted picking her up, driving around, and eventually ending up back at his house, clarifying that he was not there for sex, that they were just talking and hanging out. Evans told police that Becky said she couldn't hang out long. She had to work in a couple of hours. But according to Evans, he invited her to come back to his house in Port Jefferson, and she agreed to go with him. He told the police that as they were driving back to his house, Becky appeared to be in distress, frothing a little at the mouth and having trouble breathing, that she was very intoxicated or appeared to be overdosing on something. He started to panic. Evans claimed that since he was close to home, he would get her a glass of water. And as they entered the house through the garage door, Becky appeared unsteady on her feet and stumbled over a pair of dumbbells, falling and hitting her head on the concrete floor, rendering her unconscious. He insisted that Becky's death was accidental, emphasizing she fell and I just panicked. According to him, in a state of confusion and distress, he placed her in the back of his SUV, initially contemplating a trip to a nearby hospital. However, he abandoned that idea when she passed away during the journey, fearing the consequences as an immigrant with a criminal record. He worried that, as a black man, it would raise suspicions if he arrived at the hospital with a dead white girl in his car. Unaware of Becky's actual racial background, Evans was caught up in his own assumptions about her ethnicity. Evans informed the police that Becky tragically died in a state of panic, and he chose to remove all of her identifying features and get rid of her body. He first said he dismembered her in his garage, wrapping her body in plastic and a sheet. Later, the location where he performed this heinous act changed to a motel in Connecticut, adding another layer of inconsistency to his ever-evolving story. But one thing remained consistent with Evans's statements. He repeatedly stated, "You can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that I killed her." Despite Evans's denial of murder, detectives remained skeptical. The narrative raised questions. Even if her death was accidental, why mutilate the body, transport it to another state, and set it on fire? The detectives were not buying Evans's account, recognizing that a burning body suggests an attempt to obliterate evidence of murder, not an accident. Evans claimed that in a state of panic, he bought rubber gloves and duct tape. He booked a motel in Connecticut and ultimately purchased gasoline at a local gas station. And feeling lost, he drove around, scattering her body parts across southern Connecticut until darkness fell. Desperate to find a place to dispose of her, he eventually found a spot in Stonington. There, he pulled his car over, placed her on the ground just off the road, poured the gas he had on her, set her on fire, then drove off. Evans painted himself as the victim in a horrific accidental death. Then, in a shocking confession, Evans also admitted he was the one who sent the text messages to Barbara, posing as Becky. Evans was trying to undermine the investigation by framing Dan. He also was trying to cover his tracks and divert the investigation from murder. He knew about Dan from his brief conversation with Becky at the bar and from context clues in Becky's phone. And he used Barbara's hopes to trick her into thinking it was really Becky. Despite his efforts, police were convinced that Evans was Becky's killer. When the investigators delved deeper into Evans's background, they discovered that he was a Haitian immigrant, self-employed, and leading a seemingly regular life. They discovered that the address listed on his license was approximately 15 minutes from Becky's residence, but it did not match the location where he took Becky that fateful night. After more digging, they discovered his ties to 2 adult entertainment businesses that were, on the other hand, linked to the Port Jefferson address. His checkered past included 5 arrests, with 4 being misdemeanors. He was convicted twice, once for a domestic violence incident that involved allegations of him using his then-girlfriend for sex work, and for operating a business that involved photographing women in the same location where he took Becky. And the sheet he used to conceal Becky's body turned out to be a photographer's backdrop he used in his business. Becky's family and friends initially felt relief upon learning about Evans Ganthier's arrest, although they were puzzled by the unfamiliar name and his connection to Becky. But their relief ended abruptly when a surprising twist occurred on December 15th. The medical examiner reclassified the cause of death from homicide to pending further study. In light of Evans's narrative that Becky's demise resulted from blunt force trauma to the head when she tripped over the dumbbells, the decision was made to change the cause of death pending further investigation to make sure there was no other plausible cause for Becky's death. Due to the change in the autopsy, police had to release Evans. Without a clear determination of homicide, they lacked the grounds to detain him. And despite Evans taking intentional steps to desecrate Becky's body, New York law in 2009 did not explicitly address corpse mutilation. So police chose to release Evans until the autopsy investigation was concluded. Devastated by the reclassification of Becky's cause of death, Becky's family was determined to ensure justice prevailed. Equally fueled by this setback, detectives intensified their efforts to gather sufficient evidence proving that Becky's demise was no accident. When they reviewed their existing evidence, the investigators studied video footage depicting Evans's composed demeanor as he boarded the ferry to Connecticut. His calm exit from the vehicle and ascent up the steps contradicted the image of the panicked individual he claimed to be. Using cell site data from Evans's phone, the investigators traced his movements in Connecticut, including a visit to a grocery store. Surveillance footage revealed Evans purchasing duct tape and rubber gloves with an unsettling composure, displaying a demeanor at odds with someone distressed or agitated. His calculated and cold-blooded demeanor was observed while he studied the receipt and the change he received from the cashier with calm precision before putting it away. Then detectives returned to Evans's residence in search of the alleged murderer, the dumbbells. They found no bloodstains, particularly on the recently painted floor. The paint made forensic evidence impossible to extract. The medical examiner's official determination of the cause of death reverted to homicide after finding no evidence of blunt force trauma to Becky's head. But Dr. Camper, the medical examiner, made a startling discovery. The stab wounds to Becky's neck were inflicted while she was alive, not post-mortem. This finding indicated that those cuts did not occur when he dismembered her body, but instead when he killed her. This finding destroyed his accidental death defense. The official cause of Becky's death was determined to be stab wounds to her liver and neck. On February 8th, armed with substantial evidence and a medical examiner's conclusion that dismissed the possibility of Becky suffering fatal blunt force trauma to the head, detectives took decisive action. Evans Ganthier was arrested for the second time and charged with second-degree murder. Second-degree murder is intentional murder under New York law. At trial in July 2013, the prosecutor's theory was clear: the chain of events. Evans cozied up to Becky at the bar. She gave him her phone number and address. According to prosecutors, it was no secret what Evans had in mind when he walked up to Becky at the bar, and then later when he lured Becky into his car. When he arrived at Becky's home, she got into his SUV. He was determined to have her, but she resisted his advances, so he pulled her towards him, stabbed her in her torso and neck, as evidenced by the pool of blood on the floor of his vehicle. Forensic analysis confirmed the blood belonged to Becky. Then Becky started to froth at the mouth, showing signs of distress. And then, unfortunately, there in his car, she passed away from her injuries. The significant amount of blood and the spatter patterns in the car indicate it happened there. Determined to get rid of the evidence, Evans took her back to his garage, where he laid her body onto plastic and sheets. There, he dismembered her, removing what he thought would be all of her identifying features, overlooking her tongue piercing. He wrapped her in plastic and sheets, then loaded her body into the back of his SUV. Evans boarded the ferry to Connecticut. He went to the grocery store to purchase rubber gloves and duct tape. Then he drove around South Connecticut, scattering her body parts along the way. Evans then purchased a container of gasoline. He secured the sheets with the duct tape, then drove to a wooded country road in Stonington, Connecticut. Pulling off to the side, he placed her body just off the road, doused her with gasoline, set her body ablaze, and then drove away. Prosecutor Albertson emphasized that Evans wasn't a panicked individual attempting to erase evidence of an accident occurrence. Rather, he was actively seeking to eliminate traces of a deliberate act of murder. When Prosecutor Albertson told the jury that the killer left his thumbprints on the duct tape wrapped around Becky, and those prints traced back to the defendant, Evans raised both thumbs as if giving a bizarre thumbs up to the jury in response. This left the jury visibly startled. But what prosecutors feel they may never know are the words Evans used to lure Becky out of the house. Leaving without her purse and ID suggests she wasn't planning to go far, likely thinking she would just talk in the car. She told him she couldn't stay out long because she had to work in a couple of hours. Prosecutors will also never know the precise details of those moments leading up to her death. Detectives strongly suspect that Evans was there for a sexual encounter, and when Becky resisted, the situation escalated tragically. After a 4-week-long trial and 5.5 hours of deliberation, the jury came back with a guilty verdict. Sobs from the family filled the courtroom. Then on August 1st, 2013, Evans Ganthier was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Barbara emphasizes the importance of continuing Becky's story because Evans becomes eligible for parole in 2035. She aims to ensure that Becky's story survives throughout Evans's life, preventing him from being released to wreak havoc on another family as he's done to hers. And with this episode, our community unites in the effort to keep Becky's story alive. At the bar, Evans took Becky's phone and put the number to his burner phone in it under the fake name Jay Brown. This was a practice. He also did this to Becky's friend Jennifer. Evans is a predator, a well-spoken college graduate with a psychology degree who skillfully presented himself as a seemingly ordinary guy. And Becky, in a moment of vulnerability, let her guard down, and he exploited that trust, stabbing her and then dismembering her body. He then engaged in a sickening mind game, texting her mom days after he had taken her life. Many have drawn parallels of this story to the television series Dexter, speculating that Evans might have been on a disturbing path toward becoming a serial killer. Fortunately, his capture may have prevented more lives from being lost. Be careful out there, ladies. What do you think about the tragic circumstances surrounding this case? Do you think 25 years is enough for what he did to Becky? Let's continue the conversation down in the comment section below. As always, I'll meet you there. Thank you, Becky, for being an example of love and light. May you rest in eternal peace.